Now, Simon Clarke was one of Liz Truss's closest allies, so he had a ringside seat at the formation of the economic policy that was to bring her down. He backed Boris Johnson initially in the contest to replace her, so he was quickly out as Levelling Up Secretary when Rishi Sunak took the top job. He's also been Chief Secretary to the Treasury and criticised the size of the state. So what does he want to see from the Chancellor on Thursday? Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning, Mr Clarke. I'm not sure if you managed to catch any of Jeremy Hunt's interview, but he did say that we can all expect to be paying a bit more tax. Do you think he's got the right approach?
Yes, I think it is absolutely right that we balance the books. I would urge Jeremy to make sure that we do as much as we can from spending reductions as opposed to tax increases, noting that clearly tax is at a very high level, and faced with the recession risk that we all know exists at the moment, I think the balance of advantage and the best pro-growth option would be to reduce spending rather than to increase taxes. But I recognise he's got an incredibly difficult job to do, and he will have my support in making sure that we strike an arrangement which will give the markets confidence and the country confidence that we can pay our way in the world.
You say that you'd like to see the balance slightly tipped in favour of spending reductions. At the same time, though, a lot of public services are already under pretty deep strain, whether it's, the NHS, whether it's schools, whether it's defence. Are there any areas where there are more efficiency savings, if you like, to be found?
Well, I think the main thing is I would say that we should protect the defence budget at a time when, obviously, the world is in turmoil, when we're seeing the effects of Putin's war, and when we know that China is keeping an eye firmly on what opportunities may exist for her with Taiwan. So I would urge him not to cut the defence budget and to stick by Liz's 3% commitment of GDP by the end of the decade. But beyond that, I think there are areas where we can make savings. I think that our capital investment programmes are significantly overcommitted. I think there is a real issue with underspends across a lot of government because of the impact of COVID. And as a result, there is the potential there to realise tens of billions of savings without cutting crucially vital public services.
At the same time, though, aren't those kind of capital projects quite important for growth?
Well, some of them can be. I mean, obviously, some of them don't need to be necessarily cut. They can be cancelled, but they can also be deferred in terms of the timescale for these projects. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the case that you end them entirely, but you can say that we'll reprofile them in terms of when they will come on stream, and that offers obviously considerable savings potential. I think something like HS2, obviously we've seen rail passenger numbers have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, particularly for commuter travel. There are real questions about schemes like this, which I think ought to be addressed first before we cut things like defence, before we cut things, obviously, which really matter to the public. And I think that is the challenge, obviously, that Jeremy has to face. But my own view is, having obviously spent most of the last year as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, that the opportunity in this statement is really to reprofile our capital spend so that we can get to a more sustainable place. I really would urge him to be very careful about cutting some of the things, though, which would go to the heart of our national security.
I want to talk a bit about tax rises, because it was pretty clear that there are going to be significant tax rises next week, whether it's more high earners paying the 45p rate, whether it's millions of people being effectively paying more tax because of freezes to income levels. Now, Ian Duncan-Smith told Sky News that if the government tries to hammer us too hard with tax rises, they will actually drive us deeper into recession. Do you agree with that?
Well, one of the reasons, clearly, that I supported Liz in the summer was that I believe very strongly that, with the tax burden at a 70-year high, we need to be extremely careful about further increasing the challenges facing businesses and households. And, that is something which I know Jeremy, as an entrepreneur, will be very conscious of. I'm not saying there are easy answers here, and I certainly don't want to sort of try and suggest that the Chancellor is faced with straightforward options. But what I do think is that we have, throughout this exercise, to be incredibly aware of just how much we've asked of both the British public and British industry over recent years. Obviously, corporation tax is going to go up from 19% to 25%. That's a heck of an increase. I think family budgets are obviously, as we all know, under great pressure because of the impact of the inflation arising from the war in Ukraine. I would, therefore, as I say, strongly urge that the great balance of this statement should come from spending reductions, because I really do think that there is an issue with our raising the burden of taxation on Britain at this time.
Now, there's been a huge change of direction since the Liz Truss administration that, of course, you were such a key part of, on individual policies such as the 45p rate of tax, but also on the general philosophy as well. You know, Liz Truss wanted to borrow to fund growth. Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak are all about, you know, raising the tax burden and cutting spending in order to bring down the deficit, even in a recession. Is there a risk, do you think, that we're now swinging too far the other way to overcompensate for what came before?
Well, look, I mean, I think it is absolutely imperative that we restore market confidence in this country, and it is right that the government makes this statement this week and shows a clear path to make our debt sustainable. We've been through an extraordinary series of events. The government has acted rightly to make sure that we protect British households, but we have, as a result, got ourselves into what is a very difficult situation, and one which is obviously shared by most other Western economies. Have also had to act to protect households and businesses. I do think that in this exercise we must be careful not to choke off growth. That would be my main argument. I don't dispute the need to restore market confidence. I think it's very important that we do set out a clear runway for the years ahead. But as I say, I think that if you're faced with two difficult choices, the better choice is to curb public spending. Let's not forget that government spending as a whole has risen from some 700 billion in 2010, when the Conservatives came to office, to over £1 trillion today. So it has risen very substantially over the course of the last decade. There is the potential there, I believe, to make savings which don't damage public services and which fundamentally allow us to achieve the results that we need to, while also allowing a pro-growth policy to be delivered.
Now, I've got to ask this because I feel like many people listening to you will be asking, you know, this question. You were part of the Liz Truss core team, the Quad, if you like, and that was the team that effectively, you know, trashed the economy. The Bank of England had to step in after the budget. The Chancellor was let go. The Prime Minister became the shortest-serving ever Prime Minister in the UK. Why should people listen to what you have to say?
Well, I would reject the idea that what's happened in the economy is primarily the result of the actions that Liz took. The reality is that a third of the global economy is now in recession. We are faced with extraordinary headwinds coming out of the situation in Ukraine, which has driven inflation to levels which we haven't seen in my lifetime. That obviously comes on top of the legacy of the pandemic, not just the debt that we incurred, but also the enormously challenging societal and economic consequences that we're still feeling. And interest rates are rising the world over as a result. I completely accept that mistakes were made with the timing of the mini-budget. And whilst I take my share of responsibility as one of Liz's cabinet ministers, I obviously wasn't directly the driver of some of the choices that were made about whether or not to hold a new spending review, for example, which was something that I had urged during the summer and which I understood was the basis of the action that would be taken. But look, nonetheless, I do not resile from the fundamental proposition that Liz set out, which is that this economy, our society as a whole, needs to become more economically dynamic, more successful, if we are to sustain the public services on which people rely and to pay our way in a world where, frankly, the West needs to be more competitive if we're to keep up with emerging economies. That was Liz's fundamental insight. I think it is right. I think it is very important that as the government seeks to address the undoubted challenges that the UK economy faces, that we don't do things that cut across that fundamental mission, which is that our country needs to be a successful place to operate a business, to grow businesses large and small, and that will not happen if the burden of taxation continues to increase.
Kwasi Kwarteng, the former Chancellor, of course, under Liz Truss, gave an interview this week where he says that he warned Liz Truss about going too fast. Is that your recollection of things?
Well, I obviously wasn't privy to the individual conversations between Liz and Kwasi, and it's not really for me to interpose myself into the discussion of who said what when. I have the greatest respect for both Liz and for Kwasi, and I think the way events have played out, obviously, it has perhaps been somewhat reductive and somewhat caricatured in terms of the positions that were adopted. As I say, I believe there would be a full spending review to accompany the tax cuts that Liz wanted to make. I think that would have been the way of showing the markets that we wanted to transition to a lower tax, more dynamic economy, but that we had a clear plan to do so linked to reductions in public spending. That was certainly the position that we had discussed during the summer, and I believe it would have been a way of making Liz's fundamental mission more sustainable. And that is obviously a lasting regret that I hold. But do I think, as I say, that what Liz was saying about growth remains true? I absolutely do. And I have a lot of respect for the courage that she showed in trying to move the debate onto ground which I think is essential for the long-term health of our economy.
Just finally, when was the last time you spoke to Liz Truss, and how was she?
Well, I saw Liz at the farewell gathering that she held at Chequers last month, and I'm going to see her again this week. But she is remarkably resilient. She's always been exceptionally dignified, and there's no self-pity there. There is obviously regret, and we all share regret for what happened. And I certainly continue to regard Liz as both a great colleague and a good friend, and someone who, as I say, I think has fundamentally got her perspective on what this country needs to do right. We obviously all have to look back and learn the lessons of what happened in the autumn, but ought the message to go out that Britain should be a high-tax, high-regulation economy, as Labour want it to be, and that is the route to success. I'm afraid that is not true now. It wasn't true then, and we have to be very careful that as we seek to balance the books in this country, that we do remember that competitiveness internationally is the watchword against which ultimately all our actions ought to be judged.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Simon Clarke there in Teesside.
Thank you.